And we're live. It is Saturday, June 6th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. And summer has arrived in Washington. I know it is not the equinox yet, but when summer arrives in Washington, you just kind of know it. A oppressive heat and a wet stickiness settles in. The phrase, "it's not the heat, it's the humidity," tends to circulate as though each person has said it for the first time and has thought this idea. And people used to think it was the heat, but the speaker is informing them that actually it's the humidity. And this is one of those things that people who have lived in DC for a long time never, ever, ever say. But people who've just come here for the first time say sagely, as though you might never have thought of it before. You also know that DC summer has arrived when weeds that were growing at a very slow pace decide all of a sudden that this is their moment, and they leap out of the ground and they strangle the plants next to them overnight. You wake up one morning and small plants have been attacked by the weeds next to them. And you also know that DC summer has arrived because everybody is in a slightly less good mood than they should be under the circumstances. And normally, you know that it is a DC summer because the place is overrun with young, fresh-faced interns who are wearing the kind of like the three clothes pair of, outfits that they have on a cycle every day. And they do that for days and days and days. And it is, of course, the fashionable thing to hate the DC summer, to think the DC summer is this misery of sweat and oppressive, wet heat. And I should be on that bandwagon because I actually hate heat. I can handle whatever lower end temperature it gets to. I don't really mind cold, but above 80 degrees and I am a puddle of unpleasantness. I don't like the heat, and yet I have come to love DC summers. I love them because it brings out the contrarian in me. I love them because there's a quality, I think a little bit like the Minneapolis winter, that if you've suffered them enough to get used to them and to have strategies for getting used to them, it's a kind of a little bit of a macho thing. And also, I love them because they are emblematic of the city. The true DCer stays in August and July. The Johnny-come-latelys vacate the city and go to Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, or dare I say it, Cape Cod. But the true, real DC people sweat through these summers, and we have these rituals associated with them, jazz in the garden at the National Gallery. There's these things we do, and so I want to say that summer has come to DC. We're all cooped up in our little in our houses and our apartments, but I am here without air conditioning on my porch, waiting for that ritual of the summer day in DC, the torrential downpour, which is different from New York. New York, if you live in New York, you cannot count on a torrential downpour most days of summer. In DC today, ours has already happened, but we may get another one. The lightning storm and the beer during the lightning storm is a wonderful thing. And so I just want to say, in praise of the DC summer, as someone who hates heat, we are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we don't have anybody today. It's just us. It's Kate and me sharing the pleasant weather of Cape Cod, where we're barely out of winter, and the oppressive heat of DC, which is weighing down upon me. And yet we are here with you.
Tomorrow's monologue is gonna be late spring in Massachusetts.
Yeah,
that's gonna be like you're like already on to summer in DC, and I'm like, I had a fire in my fireplace last night.
So there's one other thing I want to, before I wrap up this monologue, that I want to address. And the person to whom this is individually addressed, will know who he or she is. But I just want to say there are people in the world that, the normal rules do not apply to. And that, I can do things, I can say things on Twitter or in lieu of fun or to Kate, and nobody, gives a fucking shit. Nobody cares. Nobody, calls me up and yells at me about it. But then the same thing said by somebody else provokes an international incident. And I'm not, just talking here about, diplomats. I'm talking about just people to whom the normal rules for some reason don't apply. And, I know I'm speaking vaguely here, but if you're one of those people that looks around the world and says, wait a minute, I just got in big trouble for doing what, hundreds of people do every minute of every day. I just, got, called by my boss and yelled at for something that my boss does 6 times a week. If you're one of those people, I want to say embrace the DC summer, embrace the heat, embrace the ridiculousness of the situation, because, that's the world we live in. We live in a world where, one of us can do something and nobody cares, doesn't matter. And another one of us does the same thing, and the knee of a police officer is on his neck for 8 minutes. And some of us can live in a city where, the weight of the heat is not always on us. Some of us live on a city where it, when it arrives in earnest for a while. And so I just want to say, embrace the reality that the world does not operate rationally. And at one level, we fight against that reality every day, and that's what these protests are about. That's what the deep cry of opposition to irrational injustice is about. And at another level, we all live with the irrationality of the world every day, and we find craziness and we find things in it that are in those irrationalities that are crazy and invigorating. And
they're the random, all of a sudden the random plants that spring out of the ground literally overnight.
And they're the things that we look at and we say, we have no way, we don't believe the world will look like this tomorrow, and all of a sudden it does. And, if you had told me 3 weeks ago that the thing that was going to make Donald Trump hide in his basement was a police murder of a, as best as I can tell, apolitical civilian, I would have said that's ridiculous. And yet here we are. And that is America in 2020, and it is DC in the summer. And so that is, we don't have a guest today. It's just crazy shit with just Kate and me.
And I loved that monologue. I loved the DC monologue, and I loved the embracing the DC summer and that type of, and the imperfections of the world monologue. I thought that was great. They were both lovely.
Well, I know somebody will be mad at me about it, but
won't be me.
Other people may not. Kate, we don't have to plan the show today because we
did a good job.
We basically already have the show planned. Let's describe the show, what we have planned for the week, and then we'll move on to other things. I have an agenda item that I want to raise with you and the audience. But let's first do what we normally do, which is describe, plan the show, but we're not going to plan it. We're just going to describe it. So what do we have for Monday and Tuesday?
So in my little piece of paper that I'm keeping this week's show on, we have, according to my notes, Matt Iglesias on Monday, Larry Lessig on Tuesday, Matt Miller on Wednesday.
So Matt Miller is tentative because we haven't
confirmed.
We haven't confirmed.
And then I actually think we don't have anyone confirmed for Thursday or Friday yet.
I think we may have Liz Garbus one of those days, the filmmaker.
Okay.
And so I think we've got one day this week we need to fill.
I'm fine with leaving that open, or I'm fine with it's kind of been stressful, but I'm less stressed now that I have not been looking at my computer for most of the day. So I'm happy to take on a little bit more in terms of planning, but Julian Sanchez, we talked about kind of bringing back some greatest hits, Ada Palmer, and
let's bring back Ada Palmer because
wait, before we bring back Ada Palmer, we might. This actually reminds me. She has a wonderful colleague named Kathleen Ballou, who is a professor at University of Chicago, and who does research on whites, has done historical research and embedded with white supremacists, and writes about them all the time, and would be amazing.
Let's do that too, but let's also bring back Ada Palmer.
Okay.
Let me see. Conversation with Ada Palmer is one of the episodes of this show that just left me wanting to have a dinner party with her.
She's the most amazing. I mean, yeah. The story of us being friends and the Mutual Admiration Society is still one of the most, and I'm not just saying this, it's one of the most boggling things that she finds me also interesting and wants to talk to me because she is so smart. And she's just such a polymath that you can't even kind of grok it. I kind of have been thinking too that it would be great to have Melissa Murray had a brief stint with us in the Dahlia and the Supreme Court episode. So it might be good to do a wrap up, not this week, but the next week of what the Supreme Court calendar looks like, maybe with Dahlia again and the ladies from Strict Scrutiny. That could be fun.
That's a great idea. Although we may want to save that for the end of the month when the Supreme Court will actually be doing the end of the term stuff.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's save it for the end of the month. That'll be good. And maybe we could do a double episode or make it an extra half hour, because once we get that many guests on, I feel like it's hard to make use of all of them.
We can go as long as we want. We sort of defined it as roughly an hour because that's what we were doing. But we can go 2 hours if we have a text or a set of texts that'll justify it.
Yeah, that sounds great. I would love that. And then, okay, so I think that means that like we're kind of in the air about Matt Miller, Liz Garbus, and Ada / Julian or someone else or Kathleen in the last 3 days of the show. And we'll figure that out. Sound good?
Sounds good. So can we shift gears and talk about something that has been on my mind?
Yeah, of course.
So 2 days ago, my wife, Tamara Kaufman-Wittes, posted on the Brookings website an essay entitled "Civil Society Creativity Around the World Can Sustain Protests in the Coronavirus Era." And I have been thinking about this essay ever since. Basically, what Tammy did was she said, look, people want to protest. They're right to want to protest. There's a lot of expressive need at this point, and yet, you don't want to kill too many people. So what are people doing? What have people done around the world when they can't go out and do mass gatherings? And she kind of surveys different cultural protests that have been effective and valuable, from pot banging, which comes from Brazil, to rooftop shouting, which is an Iranian form of protest.
Or if you're in Scotland paying the bagpipes from your roof.
That's pretty cool. And it started me thinking, today we have, it looks like tens or hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets in Philadelphia. And, I have really mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, I support peaceful protests, and these are peaceful protests, and there's a lot of reason for people to be angry, and the government keeps, both state and local governments who keep responding with inappropriate force to peaceful protests, but also the federal government, which has done the same, particularly in the district, but also the president's incendiary language gives people a lot more reason to be angry. And so on the one hand, I'm completely sympathetic, and I want these protests to be successful. And on the other hand, I don't want a lot of people to die of coronavirus. And when you have those kind of gatherings, there's going to be a body count associated with this. And I have really mixed feelings about people going out this has real expressive value. It has real political meaning. And yet the people are going to go home and communicate this disease to other people. They're going to get sick themselves. And so I was trying to think about what would be the kind of mass mobilization with real political impact that would be safe and that would make sense in this era. And so I've been thinking about it, and I wanted to throw that question open to you. When I think about these things, I think about two events that happened, that involved kind of mass mobilizations, one of which is totally inappropriate to the current circumstance, which probably predates you, Kate, is Hands Across America, which people forget was actually a protest against homelessness and a sort of an effort to raise awareness about homelessness. The other is the Ice Bucket Challenge, which is goofy as hell, but actually did raise a huge amount of money for ALS awareness. And so my question is, what is the way that we as a public can be as disruptive, as loud, as politically salient as these protests are being, without killing a lot of people? And I've been troubled by that question for the last week, and I just wanted to discuss it.
No, I'm like there. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that, and also just feeling a lot of, not like feeling like if I was in Brooklyn, I'd be at the protests, and then having the same feeling as you, which is like, I just told two or three of my friends who are Black and brown people, but who have young children, that just like, please don't go to the protests, because like, I don't want you, and you're like, even though the kids are like less, but I was like, I don't want you to get sick. Like, I don't want you to get sick. You're doing good work in other ways. Like, this is just, um, I was worried about them. And so, yeah, I've had that feeling for a while. I really don't, like, I'm obviously don't know. I guess I'm a little weary of like, I'm feeling very weary. And this is actually harkens to something about that Barry Friedman tweeted, which I'm going to get slightly wrong. I could look it up, but he basically was kind of like, well, what happened to governance? What happened to like changing the laws and like trying to, instead of burning everything down, we changed the laws, is basically kind of like what he was saying. And I read that shortly after I saw that a lot of police were protesting the suspension of, I think, oh, is it the police? And like, there was one particular horrifying incident in Buffalo that I can't even watch. John described
Yeah,
it to me.
that's a really awful incident, but you should describe it.
I don't, it's actually like, it was so disturbing. I haven't watched it. So my description of it will be secondhand in a recapitulation of John's description of it to me. But it was like so disturbing. He couldn't tell me about it because we're both from like near there, like an hour away. And like but apparently, a very elderly Black man was protesting or in the street in Buffalo, and the police struck him and then kind of just trampled him while he was obviously bleeding, and then just kind of walked over him. And I just like lack words for the type of human beings that would ever see that type of misery like right in front of them and not do anything. And on the other, like, that egregious, that kind of like corporeal and sanguine, and just like walk right over them. I know like racial bias and gender bias and all types of biases happen unconsciously all the time, but like, you have to make like some type of conscious decision to not help that person in that moment. And I just don't
Yes.
know who that person is. Like, I just don't know how you would ever do that. Like, I just don't understand. And so I thought, I was so disgusted on hearing that. And then I was more disgusted. I was talking to my mom, and like, apparently the news out of Rochester is kind of, there are similar protests happening in Rochester, and and the news out of Rochester too is that Buffalo is like, the mayor is doubling down and supporting the police. And then Cuomo is just really pissed at him for that. And so it's just like, and then they were going to suspend the few of the officers. And then in reaction to, and could be mixing up various police forces here, I honestly don't know, but like, somewhere some police got suspended, and then like the entire police force quit in solidarity with the suspensions. And I just like, I guess like part of me is just like, between like the Facebook protests walking out, the Google protests, the Twitter protests, the real live protests, all of the disease that is going to be spreading in the next 2 weeks in light of all of those real in-person protests. I'm just like, the police protesting the suspension of violence by the police. I'm just kind of like, can anyone just like stop for a second and have a conversation? Like, can we just have as like Barry, and I don't want to misquote him or misread what he was saying, but like what Barry kind of like, his tweet hit me was like, kind of like, can we go back to a principle of governance, of like building something, or trying to build something out of this instead of just tearing it down? And there is a time and a place for tearing things down, and this could be it, right? But I just think that I just think that there has to be rebuilding happening very shortly after that, because what happens in a vacuum when you tear stuff down in this type of environment, especially, is just incredibly terrifying. And I think, I don't know. Hands Across America, though, to your point, is like, I do remember Hands Across America. I remember actually the Salt Lake Olympics too. And like, you know, it wasn't protest, but I remember like the running the torch and like across America, one of my friends carried it for like 10 feet or whatever it was. Yeah, I know. They're like, if you just like hand it off to enough people, no one wants to carry it across like Moab, but like everyone will be there to carry it across like
right. Upstate New York.
Yes, exactly. But I think I think that there's a lot to be said for kind of the ice bucket challenge is interesting because I do think that there was something really stupid. Also, the weird story about the ice bucket challenge was that was the opposite of the challenge. The challenge was that you gave money to not have a fucking bucket of ice dumped over your head. And then like what the meme became, I've endured this thing. I've endured this bucket of ice and given my money. And so now you go give your money and endure this bucket of ice. It was like very strange. It was really weird.
But it had this wonderful quality that it was participatory, right? It was, I will do this absurd and unpleasant thing to draw your attention so that you will also do this absurd and unpleasant thing. And anybody could do it. Anybody could join. Now, I think that's unsatisfying if you're a Black Lives Matter protester in the current environment, because I think part of the point right now is to be disruptive and to, you know, force society to think about something. So a kind of cheerful, let's dump ice over our heads is the wrong, like you actually do want to shut something down. You want to, and so I think you're looking, but I think the thing that was dramatic and valuable about the ice bucket challenge was just the ease with which people could participate and join it. But the fact that it is unpleasant, right? It's not like baking a cake. It's actually pouring a bucket of ice on your head involves a certain level of commitment. So I actually think it's not easily applicable to this situation. Just as Hands Across America, for obvious reasons, touching each other is not like what we're looking for right now. But I do think each of them brings something to the table in terms of these kind of mass participatory things. And I think that's the language we should be thinking in right now. Just something that we need an act of will to participate in, but doesn't involve a large crowd.
Well, let's analyze this a little bit. Like the thing about ALS that I think the ice bucket challenge was that it was fun. It was a meme for a summer. It kind of hit on this time. You're right. It's not appropriate for like right now and like for racial justice and for like the protests. But the thing that really I think is much more useful about that, and I would almost say like the Hands Across America version of like virtually is kind of like how people blacked out their profile pictures or black out their Twitter profiles or like make them a certain color in solidarity with certain things. That feels kind of like similar. It's supposed to be a mass symbolic movement. But I think that the idea about the ice bucket challenge was that it raised a massive amount of money for research that was just enormously useful for like the ALS for studying and understanding ALS. And when you hear people talk about like, you know, and you read all of this, like everyone who's like kind of out there saying like, yes, protest, but also it's really important to like give money and to like, and to, you know, and to defer like your space as like a certain, you know, as a, like, I don't know. The other thing is just that like, it's very hard to figure out right now how to like, not that this is like the thing, it's really hard to figure out like the effective way to protest in any capacity. And there's a lot of anger. I'm very afraid. I'm like, not that it matters like so much, but like, I'm always afraid of saying you're doing the wrong thing, even though I feel like I stand in solidarity with people who are protesting.
So I'm not going to say that anybody's doing the wrong thing. I don't judge how people are weighing their own safety the safety of the people around them against the political point that they're trying to make. I think the political point is totally righteous, and I think people have to make their own decisions. I am struck by the lack of alternatives that don't involve the same public safety trade-offs. And I would like for there to be a way that people can participate in solidarity, in meaningfully. I mean, not just, changing your social media profile to, right, like, but that's something that actually does something that doesn't raise the same public safety concerns that mass gatherings in a period of pandemic raise. And so my point isn't to criticize what anybody's doing. It's really to try to think out of the box about to what extent we can supplement it in a way that offers alternatives. I suspect there are lots of 80-year-olds whose doctors would be horrified if they went out and joined a protest. And what about all of them, right? Should they just sit at home and do nothing? So my point isn't to criticize what anybody's doing. It's merely to be, to try to expand the range of possibility. But all that said, I'm actually pretty stumped by it. I've thought about a number of things, and I have not thought about one that seems like it would capture the moment in an effective fashion. And I'm pretty flummoxed by how difficult the problem is.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean,
so we have a number of people.
I flagged someone because I butchered, and I mean, I will say that I gave the caveat. I have not watched the video. I have not followed this because it bothered me so much. I really didn't want.
So you want to bring in Jack Sullivan?
Yeah. So but feel free to bring in someone who can give a more accurate portrayal. Like, for instance.
All right, here we go. Yeah. Jack Sullivan, the floor is yours to correct Kate.
So
I've been turn your mute off.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So I've been following the thing on Twitter, and then there's some news coverage in the New York Times today about the arraignment of two of the officers that were involved. There was a riot squad of Buffalo PD. They apparently had some orders to clear a square. Didn't seem to have terribly many people in it. 70-something white guy who apparently is some kind of peace activist, goes up and sort of encounters the officers. He doesn't, and he sort of touches them a little bit. He's not being violent at all. It's not clear exactly what he was doing. And one guy with a baton and one guy with his hand, they sort of give him a forearm shiver to push him away. Applying, more force than probably was necessary, and not really in an effort to arrest him or anything like that. But what happens is that he stumbles backwards and then falls back directly backwards. And he's holding, and there's a sound. And it's not clear whether it's the sound of what appears to be a motorcycle helmet that he's holding in his hand or his head hits the ground. And there's one angle that shows it from some steps, but there's another angle that shows this entire line of police officers. And when they hear that sound, every one of them sort of turns to see, and they all kind of freeze. And you don't see the guy hit the ground in the video. But what you do see is immediately afterwards, he is laying completely still on the ground, and blood is coming out of his ear. And there's a pool of blood right next to his head. And one of the guys, seemingly one of the guys who was involved in pushing him, starts to lean down, and it's not clear exactly what he's doing, but his demeanor is such that it looks like he's going to look after the guy a little bit. And another one of the guy grabs him by the shoulder and tells him, no, just keep going. And they report it in terms of there being somebody who's injured. But they just walk right by the guy. They do absolutely nothing to provide any kind of first aid to him. And that's kind of where the video stops. And then there was this circulated quite rapidly, and there were pretty immediate responses from Erie County Commissioner, Governor Cuomo, and so forth, saying, look, this is completely wrong, and it really seems to warrant charges. And they immediately, the DA's office, filed charges against two of the guys today. And what happens when they do the arraignment is that there's, so as a result of the charges being dropped, all of the guys on that riot squad resigned from the riot squad in protest of the fact that these guys are being charged. And today, when they're arraigned, there's a huge crowd of firefighters and other law enforcement people and supporters who are protesting the fact that they're being charged. And the police union comes out with a statement of outrage that these guys are being charged. And so it's sort of seems to be emblematic of a lot of the dynamics that are going on in terms of excessive force and police unions defending conduct that seems to be pretty indefensible. The other thing that happened was that the initial statement that came out from the Buffalo PD said one person had been injured because he tripped and fell, which seems to be completely false. Now, it's not clear.
What was that? Hold on, Jack, you just kind of blipped out for a second. One person was interviewed?
No, what they put out a statement, the Buffalo PD put out a statement immediately after the incident, and I think it was before the video came out, that said that one person had been injured as a result of the sort of the encounters that went on in the square. And it said that the person had been injured because they tripped and fell, which seems to be pretty clearly a false account of what happened. Now, it's not clear whether that statement is the result of them deliberately lying as an organization or because a report got filed that described it in that fashion. And so that's the basic story.
Thank you for that. That's super helpful. Zach Bliss, who is in Buffalo, also has some context for this incident. Zach, the floor is yours.
Context is the exact word I was going to use. So I just want to, it's there. Tonight is going to be it's going to mark a full week of protests every night in Buffalo. It hasn't been reported that much, I don't think, but there has been a lot of activity in Buffalo. And the night after this incident was the largest and most peaceful protest. It went past curfew. They didn't disperse people, but the night after it happened was the biggest and most peaceful. So that's one just good thing, I think. Like people.
No, for sure. That's great.
I'm born and raised in Buffalo, and you see like all the people I've met throughout my life here are just kind of coming together on this. But I have a sort of insulated, like I live in a bit of a Buffalo bubble in Buffalo, I guess. But there's also another thing. There was another incident a few nights ago where police officers were struck by a car. Like a few police officers were injured by a car. And there's also that kind of tension here. So there's been kind of, I don't want to say competing, but there's been multiple incidents that are just driving some tension on both sides.
Yeah, where were you raised in Buffalo, Zach?
The Elmwood Village would be kind of the area. So we're kind of near where some things are happening. The place where I get my coffee had their windows broken in some of the recent protests. But people are not happy with the local politicians here. The day of the incident, there was a vote on a budget, and they streamed it on Facebook, and a bunch of local organizations had been promoting this, telling like, call your council person, message them, tell them to vote no on the budget, like lessen the funding for the police was pretty much the main call. And the call was not met, the budget was passed, and hours later, this incident happened. And
wow.
That's very interesting context. Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zach, and stay safe. And yeah, I mean, I think if you watch the show, I'm from Rochester, and so I know the area well. It's a very, I think that Zach's context is really good. I wouldn't say that like it's a solid mix of Republicans and strong conservatives in upstate New York, with people who are like kind of there for like the excellent schools and the excellent hospitals and things like that. And like the same is true of Buffalo. And Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse all have huge histories of social unrest and being the hotbeds of social revolution. So like that's they were the last stops on the way to Canada for the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass published the North Star from Rochester. Susan B. Anthony ran the Women's Rights Convention out of Seneca Falls with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which is out in the Finger Lakes. It was a hotbed for kind of social change. It would be great to see it come back as that.
Vishnu Kannan, the great former lawfare intern, you have a question that goes right to the matter that I was thinking about and caused me to raise this protest issue. So the floor is yours.
Hey, can you hear me all right, first of all?
Yeah, but speak up because you're a little faint.
Okay, so my question is really about, I guess, the efficacy or the value of social media protests. So my Instagrams and Twitter and Facebook has been kind of lighting up with messages of solidarity, and then some information that's really useful to people who want to go out and protest, information that's useful if you want to donate or support police reform or kind of racial justice causes. But then there's a lot of just posting black squares with a hashtag. And so my question is really, do you think there's a way to do an internet-based protest that's entirely internet-based, that's not just performative and kind of signaling to your friends and your family that this cause matters to you, and that if there's a way to do internet-based protest that actually drives change?
I think was
this your question, Ben?
This is basically the question, a pithy formulation of the question that I've been struggling with, right? So
how do you have meaningful virtual protests without virtue signaling and not just being all like,
right? Is there some way to, now, of course, ultimately there is, right? So if you think about this so what's the equivalent of thousands of people going out in the middle of the street and lying down and, what ACT UP used to call a die-in? What's the virtual equivalent of that? Well, it's a DDoS attack, right? It's just like thousands of computers or millions of computers from all over the world.
Oh God, I'm almost terrified you said that. I hope that does not become sorry.
But it's right, isn't it?
It's a really good, yeah.
Now, I'm not a big fan of DDoS attacks, lawfare having been subject to a lot of them. And the problem with them is that they're too easy, right? One guy, captures a whole bunch of computers that aren't willing participants in the protests and directs a lot of traffic, or the Chinese government does it, right? So the analogy is imperfect, but that is not in answer to Vishnu's question. Imagine that 1 million people all over the country directed queries all at the same time to the Minneapolis Police Department. And by the way, I'm not endorsing that idea. I don't actually think that would be effective. But that would be a very substantial thing, right? That's not a DDoS attack because it's not automated, but that would be the equivalent or some kind of virtual equivalent of showing up and lying down in front of it. So I do think it's possible to design online protests that are not purely performative. I do think Vishnu's question is exactly right, that a lot of the time they in fact function in a purely performative fashion, like, just like people changing their social media IDs to, whatever. And it actually gives people the feeling of participation, but there's no reality to it. And so I think the challenge of this moment, if you buy that it would be desirable for fewer people to be out in the streets, and for, for social distancing not to have a big exception for protests, it would be worth a lot of our time to think about ways that, I don't know if it's online protests, by the way, as opposed to integrated online real world protests, but it would be worth a lot of our time to think about what are the creative alternatives that are actually potentially impactful.
But I wonder if the moment will be gone to a certain extent, both like, or like, I saw someone say something about this. And this is kind of how this is, this is not the reason, but this is one of the things that I've always thought about when I decide whether or not like I'm going to like change my profile to something or do whatever. And I usually don't. And it's because I'm kind of less interested in it being about me or like whatever else, which it feels like social media is. Like, even when it's not about you, it's about you. And you doing something to signal that it's not about you is still about you. And there's, and so kind of the thing that has hit me is like, instead of protest, could we like maybe be working to see what takes us out of this place of protest? Like, that's usually like where we go next, is like, you're right. There are no great ways to protest, but like DDoS attacks work because they actually they typically attack something that has such an important message to get out, or it has a massive amount of money. And so they can basically, they're constricting the supply of money or attention, right? But like taking down government websites or police websites none of them depend on the internet for any of those things, right? Their internet presence is like a service to people more than anything. Like, it's not like, and so I like, the only person that type of thing would be problematic is for individuals. Now, sometimes making individuals inconvenient so they themselves go and raise claims to other types of to the powers that be is worth doing, like in a die-in, right? Like, whereas like you lie across the freeway and no one can get to work that day, and people are so pissed that they decide to take it up with their politicians. But like, that's not necessarily, like, people don't go to like the police websites enough, I don't think, in order to for that to register. I don't know, but I do think that there's something to be said for trying to create somewhere, like, to try to like start building the next step of like where to go from here. And maybe like, I don't know, but maybe we're going to be in this spot for a while longer, and I'm like too eager to like kind of like start rebuilding and make things better. I think that the anger is like righteous. I don't like, yeah.
I think the anger is righteous too. I'm just worried that the expression of the anger is going to kill a lot of people. And I don't want to see a lot of old people or late middle-aged people die unnecessarily for the expression of that anger, if there are ways to express that anger that are as impactful, that don't require the body count. And so I'm interested
Do you think that it's like there's enough time? Like, I feel like it's almost too late. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe like, I just feel like people have been out there protesting and like they've been like together, and I just feel like we have to wait 2 weeks, and it's just, I'm so nervous for the numbers in 2 weeks.
Well, but so I agree with you, but what we've learned over the last 3 months is that the rate of infection is exponential with respect to the amount of time people spend together, right? And so, if you can reduce the amount of time that people are spending together without reducing the political expression, you will reduce the communication a lot. And I don't want to reduce the amount of political expression, but I do want to reduce the amount of time that people are spending together. And I don't think the fact that we just, like, as a society, spent a lot of time together in public and had some mass gatherings means that we should give up on the idea that doing that again and again and again is a bad idea.
I'm trying to think. I love everything you're saying. I'm trying to kind of drill down as into like what it is about in-person protests that is so powerful. And I think one of the things is just the sheer mass of it, like being part of like this huge thing that forms, and like you are one of the pieces of it, is both personally and communicate, like it just like is so much. The other thing is that actually, unlike social media, like signaling or anything else, it's really not about you. You become one of this mass, and it, like, you disappear. Right? Yes, you can tell your friends you're at the protest. Yes, we see these pictures of influencers being assholes, taking like all of these pictures of them holding signs in the front of the protest and then getting in a car and driving away. But it's really not about you. It is about the protest. And weirdly, even though there is the thing about protests is like, well, not as much now with face masks, but like they're not anonymous. Until these recent protests, there were anti-mask laws for protesting in like most places in America, and you had to put your own face and your own reputation on the line to go and protest. And I think that is, there's a certain amount of kind of like obscurity that's kind of present by going to these mass protests. But I do think that this is like that's a weird, do you see what I'm saying, Ben, with like how that like hits a weird spot in like a bunch of different ways that is just like threads a needle that I'm trying to kind of suss out?
Absolutely. And I think the elusive value of togetherness, which is something so real, and yet so difficult to pin down, why physical presence is, like, I think that's the heart of the thing, which brings me to John, don't read the whatever, I can't read your whole name.
I think it probably says don't read the comments. Is that for me,
yeah.
John?
It's has a really interesting reminder of a protest that maybe this is the model. So remind us of this incident, because I think I had forgotten about it and I remembered it as soon as I saw your question.
Yes, thanks. Yes, I'm sorry. I changed my name briefly to John. Don't read the comments, Bordeaux. And yes, that's absolutely for you, Kate.
You're John Bordeaux.
Yes.
Yeah, it's John Bordeaux.
Hi,
Thanks,
John.
John.
Sorry,
I appreciate it.
No, it's fine. I didn't realize it would roll off
Kate.
the page.
John
really
Bordeaux,
don't read the comments.
the floor is yours, and the point is important.
No, I appreciate that. I thought of the concept, and then I had to Google it myself to remember it, because it was 1979 in February. And I'm not going to read the whole article to what the reason was, but essentially caravans of farmers and tractors and trucks arrived from all over the country and then drove around the DC Beltway at like 20 miles an hour and stopped traffic and gained national attention to their issue. Socially distanced back in the day, but it just reminds me of something that I remember in, again, 1979. I wasn't here, but I knew about it as a New Yorker. So it seems like there are some innovative concepts that might apply in this age.
I love
I mean-
that. If anyone gave a shit about getting anywhere anymore, like there is an increase in traffic though. You're right. I bet but yes, I love that idea. I think that's amazing.
I mean, I think that's exactly the kind of thing that I was thinking about, right? It's something that people can do safely. It's something that anybody can participate in. It's
That has a
something
car.
it's something that people can do in their local communities, right? It doesn't have to be in DC. These are national protests, but if people could do them in a fashion that like actually has a lot of respect for the health and safety components of the moment, like I think that's the most useful idea that I've heard in 5 or 6 days of thinking about it.
Well, let's think about that more in terms of like, I love that. And like what I think I like about that the most is that you could still get in a car with your friends or like the people you're quarantined with, decide to all go protest, still be safe in a car. And like, you're in a car and then you could use the car in different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be to slow down traffic. Like there could be other things. Like you just completely like, you just all like swarm on Manhattan.
Right. I mean, I think there's a million variants of it that might be very local in nature, but I really think that the spirit of what John is suggesting there is exactly what we should be thinking about, ways to be involved that anybody can be involved in. I'm not opposed to disruption. I do think we have to think about
but
how
like
many
what if people even
we
just
just
drove
had
out
100,000 people die, and it would be a real irony if we had another 100,000 people die to protest police killings. And I think that's the kind of thinking we need.
What if there was a car protest and like wherever people were, they just drove out onto major thoroughfares and just stopped their car for like 30 minutes all at the same time? That would be Hands Across America plus like Ice Bucket Challenge plus like what they said plus like protest. I think that would be
America.
amazing.
Yeah. Catherine Maddox, you get the last word today.
Hi, nice to see you guys.
Good to see you.
Hi, Catherine.
Or hear you.
Oh, yeah, I'm drinking a grapefruit Hefeweizen from Germany.
Is it good?
It is spectacular, refreshing, and not too boozy, and it's very pretty to look at as well, like your Campari.
Oh, it's so the Campari is so pretty. My friend that's my friend Cash's like favorite drink is like grapefruit beer every summer. She was like, that's all I ever bring her. So
it's very refreshing. Anyways, I know you guys are wrapping up. Actually, I want to call you Mr. Wittis, but of course, because I listen to you in my ears. I listen to you in my ears. I'm like, his name is Ben. You haven't been
Mr. Wittis sounds really remote.
I know.
On Lieu of fun. I mean,
I know.
Mr. Wittis is like my uncle or something.
I know.
Although I don't have an uncle who's a Wittis.
I know. I know you need to wrap up, but I was just wondering because I just was looking on Twitter, and I'm an Anglophile, having lived over in Britain and studied there. There are really big protests there. There are huge protests in Australia. That said, having looked at all the stuff in the States today, I just wonder if this is, as I put in the question, about this whole issue about Trump, that people, if he had handled the Lafayette Square thing not at all or differently, I just wonder if it's fueled by that people are just so sick and tired.
Was the Lafayette Square thing the Bible thing?
Yeah. It was really, I mean, it
was really bad.
That was so awful.
It's 3.5 years of being insulted by this guy. I mean, every time he talks to the public, he's basically flipping us the bird. And, you don't have to be a serious patriot to start to say, and maybe that's what this is, because this does seem it's a little bit scary. I'm concerned about what's going on a little, although I support it.
I mean,
That's
the
all.
thing that Catherine, I think that's a great point. Ben, you can like fill in is like, I just want to like say quickly, the thing that this has always bothered me, and I'm sure David French, who was on the show this week, would agree as an evangelical Christian, which is just like the fact that like, it just is so obvious. It seems so clear that Trump has taken the mantle of like evangelical Christians or born again Christians and like there's no sincerity or thoughtfulness around it. It is just a tool. Like there's no way he lived his life that way. There's nothing in his background that suggests that. Like the famous quote of like, what's your favorite passage in the Bible? Are you an Old Testament person or are you a New Testament person? And like not being able to like say like anything. It just is kind of just that moment in particular. I mean, it just doesn't even faze me anymore. Like after kind of the Bible quotes. And like, so I'm curious, like that people think that finally broke the camel's back in some regard. Ben, what is your take?
I agree with you both, actually. So I think that I don't believe that a police killing by local police in Minneapolis, as awful as the George Floyd case was and is, in which the police department fired the people immediately and charges were filed against all of them promptly, I don't believe that in the Barack Obama is still president, provokes the national sustained outrage that it has in an environment in which not only was, in which Trump's response and Barr's response and the police's response were in a, if not coordinated way, certainly mutually supported way, so horrible and so insulting and so racist. And so I do think I agree with Catherine that there is a relationship between I think there's a relationship between the political environment in which it takes place and the reaction to it and the strength of the public sentiment. And by the way, I will say the diversity of the public sentiment, because, it is remarkable how this is not just the same group of people who were protesting Ferguson, right? This is a huge number of white people. It's a huge number of not young progressive types, right? This is a much more diverse coalition and so in that sense, I really do agree with Catherine that I think the response of the police, the response of the Trump administration, and the response of the president himself have been really significant here. I also agree with you that there is nothing whatsoever surprising about that response. And, that I think you can hold those two ideas in your mind at the same time, that the response is kind of exactly what you would expect from them, but it also has served to fuel a lot of the intensity and diversity of the reaction. So that's, for whatever it's worth, that's my thought on the subject.
Did you see the latest ABC poll numbers giving him like a 32% approval rating on his handling of the Floyd protests, 38% kind of predictable about COVID, about like from his base. But
so that's quite interesting, because that 32% is probably 8 points below what we think of as his floor.
Yeah.
Right. We think of his floor as 38 to 40%.
Yeah.
And this is below that. And that means there are some people who are saying, hey, basically, I like the guy, but this is beyond the pale. And that's a real political danger sign for the president.
So I don't think I've ever told you this, but yesterday, so I've talked to you about the people that live next door to me here, and like their teacher and electrician And to say that they're Trumpers and they would have like, they also half raised me growing up, and like, they're wonderful and I love them and they're, you know, great people, but like, they are my dose of like conservative reality from like my bubble that I'm often in. And yesterday I went over and one of them, I won't say any names, but like the guy, the father of the household has just had a heart attack and is recovering, trying to figure out what to do with like the fact that he has to just like sit around all the time. So he started to make his own ammunition. He just like has literally one of those presses on a piece of 2x4 laying across his lap, and just like making bullets. And like, this is what he's doing. And I asked him what he thought of the protest, and he was like, I think that they're right. That was like what Floyd did was wrong. And like sorry, not what Floyd did was wrong. What the police officer did to Floyd was wrong. And this was like completely inappropriate and wrong. And the president's reaction was wrong. It was the first time I'd ever heard him say anything against, I don't know what it was. I don't know what it was about this moment. Like, there have been so many Black men and women that have died, and I have no idea what it was, but like, something's happened. And I took that as like a positive sign, even though.
Well, I mean, the poll data suggests that like he is not alone in that regard of being generally supportive of the president, but being uncomfortable with his reaction to this. So on that cheerful note, let's wrap up. Tomorrow we have a mystery guest. I will surprise you all. And on Monday,
you said I have to have a very good internet connection. Is this fine?
I did.
I thought you did. You said that I had to have like something for, anyways, maybe not.
No. Normal internet connection will do just fine.
Oh, okay. Maybe it was for yesterday. And it was
it was for yesterday.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was Gail who needed a good internet connection. We will be back tomorrow at 5 Eastern time. And until then, Kate, what do we say?
In lieu of fun, or you can't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, come hang out with us and pour a bucket of ice over your head.
Yep, that's what we say.
That's
See you
what
tomorrow.
we say.